This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, get ready, because today we're going deep into history.
Oh, yeah.
The post-World War II economic world.
I love it.
You know, you sent over that podcast episode, 72, the post-war economic impact of the U.S. on the global stage.
Yep.
And I gotta say, I'm pretty excited to dig into it.
Me too.
Our mission today is to figure out how the U.S. became such an economic powerhouse after World War II and what that means for us today.
Definitely a period that still impacts us hugely.
I think you're right.
I mean, if you want to understand the world today,
Yeah.
you got to understand how the U.S. rose to dominance back then.
Absolutely. And the podcast just jumps right in.
Oh, yeah.
It throws this crazy statistic at you.
Really?
The U.S. gross national product,
Okay.
the GNP, went from $88.6 billion in 1939
Wow.
to $135 billion by 1945.
During the war.
Yeah, during the war.
That's wild.
It's a huge jump.
Yeah, and you know what that shows?
What's that?
The huge gap between the U.S. and Europe at the time.
Oh, yeah.
You had Europe, you know? Building.
Picking up the pieces.
Exactly, after all that destruction.
Right.
And then you have the U.S., not only are they fine,
Right.
they're ending rationing.
Wow.
And their economy is booming.
So they're like coming out stronger
Exactly.
than they went in.
Stronger.
It's hard to imagine
I know, right?
coming out of a world war stronger than before.
It's a total power shift.
It really is.
A global power shift.
I mean, how did they actually use this power?
Well, a big turning point was the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944.
Okay.
44 allied nations get together,
Right.
but the U.S. is leading the charge.
Okay, I see.
And that's where we get the IMF and the World Bank.
The IMF and the World Bank.
Yeah,
I've heard those names.
of course.
But to be honest,
What is it?
I don't really know what they do.
Well, think of them as like
Okay.
the architects of global finance.
Okay.
The IMF. They wanted to stabilize currencies,
Okay.
and the World Bank focused on reconstruction and development projects.
Interesting.
But the big change,
The U.S. dollar.
Yeah.
It became the world's reserve currency pegged to gold.
so other countries needed U.S. dollars
To trade.
to be on the world stage.
Exactly.
Wow.
Huge demand for U.S. currency.
So the U.S. was basically the world's banker,
Pretty much.
and they built the system on their own ideas.
It's true.
And it worked.
Oh, yeah.
It really solidified their power.
Global influence for sure.
I mean, was anyone else even a little hesitant about that?
I'm sure some were.
I guess after the war,
People wanted stability.
right? Stability was key.
And with this power,
Yeah.
they created the Marshall Plan in 1948.
Oh, yeah, the Marshall Plan.
Over $13 billion in aid
For Europe.
for Europe to rebuild.
Wow, that's $140 billion in today's money.
It's incredible.
It's hard to fathom that kind of money.
I know.
And the podcast mentioned that it wasn't just about rebuilding, it was strategic too.
Definitely.
Like they had an ulterior motive.
Well, rebuilding infrastructure and boosting trade were important.
Yeah. But it was also about the Cold War,
Okay.
about stopping communism from spreading
So they wanted to create strong capitalist allies
in Western Europe. Yes,
to align with U.S. interests.
precisely.
So it was an economic lifeline,
Yes,
but also a move in the Cold War.
it was both.
A two-pronged approach.
Exactly.
Oh,
The Marshall Plan was a powerful tool,
for sure.
but it was also controversial.
Yeah, I bet.
It shows how policies,
Yeah.
even ones that seem straightforward,
Right.
can have huge consequences
Long-lasting consequences.
that we're still dealing with today.
It makes you think
It does.
about the power of economics
And the power of decisions.
on the world stage.
Absolutely. I mean, people really debated it.
Oh, yeah.
How do you interpret something that big?
Right.
Traditional historians,
Yeah.
they say it was an act of generosity,
Okay.
purely to help Europe.
Okay.
But then revisionist historians,
Right.
they say it was about U.S. interests,
Oh, I see.
about containing communism, and ensuring U.S. dominance.
So two very different interpretations.
Yeah, and that's what makes history so interesting.
For sure.
It's rarely black and white.
Yeah, it's about perspective
Exactly.
and interpretation.
Exactly.
Speaking of perspective,
Yeah.
the podcast also talked about the UN.
Oh, the United Nations.
Yeah, formed in 1945,
Right after the war.
right after the war.
A symbol of global cooperation.
But was it really neutral?
Well, the U.S. was definitely a driving force.
Okay.
They wanted a new world order
I see.
focused on preventing another war,
Right.
on diplomacy,
Okay.
collective security.
So the U.S. had a vision,
They did.
and it's headquartered in New York.
Right in New York City.
Speaks volumes
It does.
about their influence.
For sure.
What else happened around this time?
Well, in 1947, you have GATT,
AZT.
the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade.
Okay, and what was that about?
Reducing tariffs.
So basically making it easier.
Yeah, for countries to trade with each other.
Sounds good to me.
It was a big push for free trade.
Led by the U.S.
Oh, yeah. They saw it as a way to expand capitalism globally.
So I'm guessing not everyone loved that?
Well, some people worried about exploitation.
Right.
Or losing their national sovereignty.
It's a mixed bag.
But JT2 laid the groundwork.
For what?
For the World Trade Organization.
The WTO.
The WTO that we have today.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So we've got the Marshall Plan.
Right.
The UN.
Uh-huh.
JTT.
Yeah. The U.S. was shaping the world.
It sounds like it.
Economically and politically.
Did anyone else step up?
Well, the U.S. was the main player.
Okay.
But other countries contributed.
Great who?
The podcast mentioned Canada.
Okay.
They were a superpower.
Right.
But they helped with European recovery.
Through the Commonwealth.
Yes.
So there was a sense of shared purpose.
Among the Western nations.
But what about the Cold War?
That was heating up.
At the same time.
Yeah, while the U.S. was building ties with Western Europe.
Through the Marshall Plan.
Right. Tensions with the Soviet Union were rising.
It's crazy how economics and politics...
It's so connected.
Yeah, totally.
And the Marshall Plan, it had a big geopolitical impact.
So the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe,
Right.
they weren't part of the Marshall Plan?
They weren't.
Did they refuse or were they excluded?
Well, some historians say Stalin saw it as a threat.
A threat?
Yeah, a way for the U.S. to control Western Europe.
Well,
Others say the Soviets were interested.
really?
But the conditions weren't acceptable.
So we don't really know for sure.
It's unclear.
But either way,
Yeah.
it reinforced the divide,
Between East and West.
the Iron Curtain.
Exactly.
So the Marshall Plan.
It was meant to rebuild.
Yeah.
But it ended up contributing to the Cold War.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah. One thing leads to another.
And then we have the U.S. and the Soviet Union,
As the two superpowers,
both wanting global influence.
but with different approaches.
The U.S. had economic power.
And the Soviet Union had military might.
Two totally different models.
Two different paths to power.
And it makes you wonder,
Whoa.
how much of that rivalry,
Still affects us today.
right, how much of the world today,
Is shaped by the Cold War.
it's a question worth asking.
It is.
The Cold War might be over,
Officially, yes.
but its legacy lives on.
It does.
We're still feeling the ripple effects.
Definitely.
It shows how history isn't just the past.
It's connected to the present.
It's a continuous story.
It shapes who we are.
Okay, so we've covered a lot.
We have.
The U.S. economic boom,
Uh-huh.
Bretton Woods,
The Marshall Plan,
the UN.
the Cold War.
It's a lot to take in
But it's all important.
for understanding the world.
The world today.
And it makes me think about what's happening now.
Like, right.
Rising tensions,
Yeah.
economic uncertainty, shifting alliances.
It feels familiar.
It does, doesn't it?
Like we're at another turning point.
Like the post-World War II era.
Maybe.
Like history is repeating itself.
Well, not exactly. But it often rhymes.
That's a good way to put it.
We can learn from the past.
To make better choices now.
Exactly. History can guide us.
If we let it.
If we pay attention.
Yeah, it's like we're looking back at ourselves almost.
What's really interesting is how decisions made after World War II, they're still shaping our world.
Like, what?
Well, take the Bretton Woods system. The dollar isn't tied to gold anymore,
Right.
but it's still the world's reserve currency.
It's like the ghost of Bretton Woods that's
Okay.
hanging around.
Yeah, that legacy is huge for global finance, even today.
So we're still living with the consequences.
Absolutely.
And what about the Marshall Plan? Are there any modern-day versions of that?
Oh, yeah.
Like what?
Well, the idea of using economic aid
Yeah.
as a tool
A tool for what?
for foreign policy,
Okay.
for rebuilding,
Okay.
and for influence,
Interesting.
that's still very relevant.
Give me an example.
Think about aid packages to developing nations, or efforts to help economies in conflict zones.
Right.
The Marshall Plan showed how economic power can be used globally.
So it's like a model.
In a way, yeah.
It makes you wonder if today's leaders ever look back and think, hey, that worked pretty well.
It's definitely been studied.
I bet.
And debated, for sure.
And of course, we can't forget about the Cold War.
Right.
That fight between capitalism and communism.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not as obvious now.
That's more subtle,
But is it still influencing things?
I think so.
It's like those tensions never really went away.
They just changed shape.
They adapted
to the new world.
And that struggle for power.
Yeah.
It's always there, isn't it?
It's part of human nature.
I guess so.
But understanding the past,
Yeah.
it can help us understand how power works today.
So what's the big takeaway here?
After all this.
Yeah, after this deep dive.
Well, I think the main thing is
Yeah.
it's all connected.
What do you mean?
The economics,
Okay.
the politics,
Uh-huh.
the ideologies. They're all linked together.
Globally. Like what happens in one place affects everyone.
It's a chain reaction.
And it never stops.
It's constantly evolving.
So we need to understand history.
More than ever.
To understand the world.
To make good decisions.
Absolutely. So listener,
Yeah.
as we wrap up this deep dive into the post-World War II world.
It's been a journey.
It really has. We'll leave you with this. How do you think the U.S.'s actions after World War II still affect us today?
Good question.
What parallels do you see?
To the world now.
Keep exploring.
Keep thinking.
Keep learning.
And join us next time
for another deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.